There is no one way to end a project on the century. After all, there are so many more stories to be told. But we did want to look ahead somewhat. And so over the past few weeks, we've been talking to some of the world's great writers and scientists, musicians and businessmen and economists. And we've asked them to contemplate the past and think about the future. Here's some of what they had to say.
My personal history is very much informed by the history of the 20th century. My parents, my father was born in 1911, left China in 1936, went to France, stayed there for 27 years, and we moved to America in 1961. For probably the first 20 years of my life, the most often asked question in my musical life was, how can someone with your Asian background play Western classical music? I think it's actually an example of the changes in the world that somehow result in that question really not being asked anymore.
I think the main thing to know about the major issues of the next century is that we will be surprised. Time is asymmetrical. You can know about the past, but you can't influence it. You can influence the future, but you can't actually know what's going to happen. And there's a statistical reason for this. You can think, what are the various probabilities that might occur in the next 100 years? And think seriously about them and play them out and do scenarios and so on. But the fact is, the number of things which may occur which are completely improbable is a great deal larger than that. And so chances are it's those improbable things that will occur. And so you will be deeply surprised.
100 years ago, you could be pretty sure that the technology of your parents' generation would be very similar to yours, and the technology of your generation would be very similar to that of your children. There would be some changes, sometimes important ones, but rarely would there be changes so radical the entire society would be remade. But in the 20th century alone, we faced changes that radical a number of times. Let's just mention a few of them. Think about it. The theory of relativity, the birth control pill, the science of statistics, which led to eventually the personal computer, aircraft, nearly instantaneous communication, and of course the ability to blow up the entire world several times over. These were all radically earth-changing technologies. So many in one century is virtually unheard of. In the 19th century, there were probably two, the railroad and the telephone, and they came at opposite ends of the century, had plenty of time to think it through. The 18th century, steam maybe, one. Before that, gunpowder. You had one or two a century. We have them every few years. Our entire world reconfigures itself because of technological change. So we simply have more changes happening more rapidly, and so it's harder and harder for our moral understanding to keep up.
I hope that whatever we're forced to face, it will be done on the basis of human tolerance and a respect for the rights and dignity of other people. Avoiding savagery, avoiding cruelty, that's the most important thing people can do. And if we think about how we want people to grow up in the next century, what matters is not the large issues. What matters is not what party they vote for, what job they have, or what piece of technology they know about. What matters are their manners, the little things. Are they polite? Are they deferential? Do they recognize the rights of other people? Do they take their turns? If those things can be done, I think the larger issues will probably take care of themselves.
Developmental psychologists have convinced us that what's important is quality time. Is when we get home from our stressful big days and we have 15 minutes or half an hour or even an hour, It's how we use that hour with one another that's most significant. Engaging one another, reading, holding, paying attention. I think that's very important, but I've become increasingly interested in quantity time. In time where there's no structure, where there's no purpose, where there's no agenda, where there's no particular thing that needs to get done. You're just hanging out, being with one another. And I think we've lost that, and I think that's essential.
The most surprising lesson of the 20th century to me was feminism. It was the discovery of a new world. I was born in a very patriarchal time, and I belong to the generation that made the transition, the generation that was brought up to be like our mothers and ended up being like our granddaughters. So we got a lot of aggression. It was very difficult, but it was a wonderful time. And I really think that the emergence of feminism is the most revolutionary force of the century, certainly more than communism, for example, or the expectations we had about scientific development. Feminism has changed the culture in many ways, and it is only the beginning of this revolution. I think we're just starting. What may happen in the future is fantastic.
A really crucial thing is to reject the idea of purity. You know, that when the moment people start talking about, you know, racial purity, cultural purity, ethnic purity, this leads directly to the gas chamber. You know, it leads directly to ethnic cleansing. It leads to mass murder, really. And so I've come to feel that probably the most important thing to learn is the value of impurity. You know, that's say not for things not to be cleansed. You know, a bit of dirt, I think, is very valuable. So I think that probably, if there's one thing to learn about the 20th century, is that anybody who wants to simplify life into something pure, anybody who claims to have that one idea, one race, one cultural definition is a total explanation of what's right and good and how things should be, that's the person to put the straitjacket on, you know. And those who are the advocates of the impure, you know, it's just you know, not too much, just a little dirt, you know. That's the way to go, I would say.
The biggest thing we suffer from, and children understand this and respond to it much more readily than grown-ups, I think, and that is just meism. We suffer from just meism. I'm one person. The world has millions, billions, growing all the time. So, yeah, I know I shouldn't run a tap and waste the water. I know I should turn off the electric light. It's better to walk and not take the car even though it's raining. I know all these things, but it can't possibly matter what I do, can it? Because I'm just one person. And look at the waste around me, so it doesn't matter. So, again, if we could turn that around and have the billions of people all knowing what I do is really very important, the world would change overnight. And children really seem to get that message. So the most important message is that you as an individual matter. You really do matter, and you have a very important role to play in this life, and don't forget it.
One of the outstanding products of science and technology, particularly in the last century, is it's given people a smothering array of choices in their lives, in their economic behavior, and where they go, what they believe in, and so on. And out of it has come the perception that science can be good or evil. But that's wrong. Science and the knowledge that comes from science is always good. What can be evil is the choice we make of the use of that knowledge. And thus, we almost chose to use our knowledge of the atom to obliterate a good part of the world. We chose wisely and moved away. Now, with the biomedical and genetic revolution, We have the choice to clone human beings if we wish. We have the choice to modify our genes and perhaps even alter, eventually, human nature itself. What choices we will make does not depend on the knowledge so much as on our ethics, how we perceive ourselves as a species, and what our goals are.
Whenever we make a new scientific discovery about our planet or our universe, what we think has to change along with it. I mean, it's a terrible shock to have to admit that everything doesn't surround us, round and round us. We're not the center, we're peripheral. We're sort of off the edge of a very minor galaxy. And that changed the way everybody thought. What people thought was God had made the planet and people, and that was the main purpose. Doesn't seem to be so anymore. So what do you do? It's entirely new universe. You've got to start thinking. So what is our place? Do we matter? Is there any point in having human beings? Do we make a difference? Can we change things?
Around the turn of the century, there was a definite clash between theology and science. But I think now, as we reach the end of the century, we have found a willingness on the part of the scientific camp and the theological camp to recognize that, yes, science is really well equipped to describing how the physical universe works. Probably better than theology. But theology, God-like explanations, are much better equipped to give us a sense of meaning, a sense of why, with a capital W, there is a universe and why there is life. Questions that science really can't answer at all.
For the Century, I'm Peter Jennings. Good night.
You can read more about this remarkable time in the century, written by Peter Jennings and Todd Brewster, published by Doubleday and sold in bookstores everywhere. Also look for the Century audiobook edition, available on compact disc and audio cassette.
My musical life was, how can someone with your Asian background play Western classical music? I think it's actually an example of the changes in the world that somehow result in that question really not being asked anymore.
I think the main thing to know about the major issues of the next century is things which may occur which are completely improbable is a great deal larger than that. And so chances are it's those improbable things that will occur. And so you will be deeply surprised.
100 years ago, you could be pretty sure that the technology of your parents' generation would be very similar to yours. And the technology of your generation
My personal history is very much informed by the history of the 20th century. My parents, my father was born in 1911, left China in 1936, went to France, stayed there for 27 years, and we moved to America in 1961. For probably the first 20 years of my life, the most often asked question in
that we will be surprised. Time is asymmetrical. You can know about the past, but you can't influence it. You can influence the future, but you can't actually know what's going to happen. And there's a statistical reason for this. You can think, what are the various probabilities that might occur in the next 100 years, and think seriously about them and play them out and do scenarios and so on. But the fact is, the number of things...
There is no one way to end a project on the century. After all, there are so many more stories to be told. But we did want to look ahead somewhat. And so over the past few weeks, we've been talking to some of the world's great writers and scientists, musicians and businessmen and economists, and we've asked them to contemplate the past and think about the future. Here's some of what they had to say.